gave her the sovereign, and hurried to the Golden Alp, where there was a waiter who spoke English. The translation given him was this: at 3 o'clock they start in a carriage on the road to Linz. They have bad horses. The Herr also rides a white horse. Swithin at once hailed a carriage and started at full gallop on the road to Linz. Outside the Mirabel garden he caught sight of Castells and grinned at him. I've sold him anyway, he thought, for all their talk, they're no good, these foreigners. His spirits rose, but soon fell again. What chance had he of catching them? They had 3 hours' start. Still, the roads were heavy from the rain of the last 2 nights. They had luggage and bad horses. His own were good, his driver bribed. He might overtake them by 10 o'clock. But did he want to? What a fool he had been not to bring his luggage. He would then have had a respectable position. What a brute he would look without a change of shirt, or anything to shave with. He saw himself with horror, all bristly, and in soiled linen. People would think him mad. I've given myself away flashed across him. What the devil can I say to them? And he stared sullenly at the driver's back. He read Rosie's letter again. It had a scent of her. And in the growing darkness, jolted by the swinging of the carriage, he suffered tortures from his prudence, tortures from his passion. It grew colder and dark. He turned the collar of his coat up to his ears. He had visions of Piccadilly. This wild goose chase appeared suddenly a dangerous, unfathomable business. Lights, fellowship, security. Never again, he brooded, why won't they let me alone? But it was not clear whether by they he meant the conventions, the Boleskis, his passions, or those haunting memories of Rosie. If he had only had a bag with him. What was he going to say? What was he going to get by this? He received no answer to these questions. The darkness itself was less obscure than his sensations. From time to time he took out his watch. At each village the driver made inquiries. It was past 10 when he stopped the carriage with a jerk. The stars were bright as steel, and by the side of the road a reedy lake showed in the moonlight. Swithin shivered. A man on a horse had halted in the center of the road. "Drive on," called Swithin, with a stolid face. It turned out to be Boleski, who, on a gaunt white horse, looked like some winged creature. He stood where he could bar the progress of the carriage, holding out a pistol. Theatrical beggar, thought Swithin, with a nervous smile. He made no sign of recognition. Slowly Boleski brought his lean horse up to the carriage. When he saw who was within he showed astonishment and joy. "You," he cried, slapping his hand on his attenuated thigh, and leaning over till his beard touched Swithin. "You have come. You followed us. It seems so," Swithin grunted out. "You throw in your lot with us. Is it possible? You are a knight-errant then?" "Good God," said Swithin. Boleski, flogging his dejected steed, cantered forward in the moonlight. He came back, bringing an old cloak, which he insisted on wrapping round Swithin's shoulders. He handed him, too, a capacious flask. "How cold you look," he said. "Wonderful. Wonderful. You English." His grateful eyes never left Swithin for a moment. They had come up to the heels of the other carriage now, but Swithin, hunched in the cloak, did not try to see what was in front of him. To the bottom of his soul he resented the Hungarian's gratitude. He remarked at last, with wasted irony, "You're in a hurry, it seems." "If we had wings," Bolesky answered, "we would use them." "Wings," muttered Swithin thickly, "legs are good enough for me." X arrived at the inn where they were to pass the night. Swithin waited, hoping to get into the house without a scene, but when at last he alighted the girls were in the doorway, and Margit greeted him with an admiring murmur, in which, however, he seemed to detect irony. Rosie, pale and tremulous, with a half-scared look, gave him her hand, and, quickly withdrawing it, shrank behind her sister. When they had gone up to their rooms, Swithin sought Bolesky. His spirits had risen remarkably. "Tell the landlord to get us supper," he said. "We'll crack a bottle to our luck." He hurried on the landlord's preparations. The window of the room faced a wood, so near that he could almost touch the trees. The scent from the pines blew in on him. He turned away from that scented darkness, and began to draw the corks of wine bottles. The sound seemed to conjure up Bolesky. He came in, splashed all over, smelling slightly of stables. Soon after, Margit appeared, fresh and serene, but Rosie did not come. "Where is your sister?" Swithin said. Rosie, it seemed, was tired. "It will do her good to eat," said Swithin. And Bolesky, murmuring, "She must drink to our country," went out to summon her. Margit followed him, while Swithin cut up a chicken. They came back without her. She had a grim of the spirit. Swithin's face fell. "Look here," he said, "I'll go and try." "Don't wait for me." "Yes," answered Bolesky, sinking mournfully into a chair. "Try, brother, try. By all means, try." Swithin walked down the corridor with an odd, sweet, sinking sensation in his chest, and tapped on Rosie's door. In a minute, she peeped forth, with her hair loose, and wondering eyes. "Rosie," he stammered, "what makes you afraid of me, now?" She stared at him, but did not answer. "Why won't you come?" Still she did not speak, but suddenly stretched out to him her bare arm. Swithin pressed his face to it. With a shiver, she whispered above him, "I will come," and gently shut the door. Swithin stealthily retraced his steps, and paused a minute outside the sitting room to regain his self-control. The sight of Bolesky with a bottle in his hand steadied him. "She is coming," he said. And very soon she did come, her thick hair roughly twisted in a plait. Swithin sat between the girls, but did not talk, for he was really hungry. Bolesky too was silent, plunged in gloom. Rosie was dumb. Margit alone chattered. "You will come to our father town?" We shall have things to show you. Rosie, what things we will show him? Rosie, with a little appealing movement of her hands, repeated, what things we will show you. She seemed suddenly to find her voice, and with glowing cheeks, mouths full, and eyes bright as squirrels, they chattered reminiscences of the dear father town, of dear friends, of the dear home. A poor place. Swithin could not help thinking. This enthusiasm seemed to him common, but he was careful to assume a look of interest, feeding on the glances flashed at him from Rosie's restless eyes. As the wine waned, Bolesky grew more and more gloomy, but now and then a sort of gleaming flicker passed over his face. He rose to his feet at last. "Let us not forget," he said, "that we go perhaps to ruin, to death. In the face of all this we go, because our country needs. In this there is no credit, neither to me nor to you, my daughters, but for this noble Englishman, what shall we say? Give thanks to God for a great heart. He comes, not for country, not for fame, not for money, but to help the weak and the oppressed. Let us drink, then, to him, let us drink again and again to heroic foresight." In the midst of the dead silence, Swithin caught the look of suppliant mockery in Rosie's eyes. He glanced at the Hungarian. Was he laughing at him? But Bolesky, after drinking up his wine, had sunk again into his seat, and there suddenly, to the surprise of all, he began to snore. Margit rose and, bending over him like a mother, murmured, "He is tired, it is the ride." She raised him in her strong arms, and leaning on her shoulder, Bolesky staggered from the room. Swithin and Rosie were left alone. He slid his hand towards her hand that lay so close, on the rough tablecloth. It seemed to await his touch. Something gave way in him, and words came welling up. For the moment he forgot himself, forgot everything but that he was near her. Her head dropped on his shoulder, he breathed the perfume of her hair. "Good night," she whispered, and the whisper was like a kiss, yet before he could stop her she was gone. Her footsteps died away in the passage, but Swithin sat gazing intently at a single bright drop of spilt wine quivering on the table's edge. In that moment she, in her helplessness and emotion, was all in all to him, his life nothing, all the real things, his conventions, convictions, training, and himself, all seemed remote, behind a mist of passion and strange chivalry. Carefully with a bit of bread he soaked up the bright drop, and suddenly he thought, "This is tremendous." For a long time he stood there in the window, close to the dark pine trees. 11 in the early morning he awoke, full of the discomfort of this strange place and the medley of his dreams. Lying, with his nose peeping over the quilt, he was visited by a horrible suspicion. When he could bear it no longer, he started up in bed. What if it were all a plot to get him to marry her? The thought was treacherous, and inspired in him a faint disgust. Still, she might be ignorant of it. But was she so innocent? What innocent girl would have come to his room like that? What innocent girl? Her father, who pretended to be caring only for his country. It was not probable that any man was such a fool. It was all part of the game, a scheming rascal. Castiles, too, his threats. They intended him to marry her. And the horrid idea was strengthened by his reverence for marriage. It was the proper, the respectable condition. He was genuinely afraid of this other sort of liaison. It was somehow too primitive. And yet the thought of that marriage made his blood run cold. Considering that she had already yielded, it would be all the more monstrous. With the cold, fatal clearness of the morning light, he now for the first time saw his position in its full bearings. And, like a fish pulled out of water, he gasped at what was disclosed. Sullen resentment against this attempt to force him settled deep into his soul. He seated himself on the bed, holding his head in his hands, solemnly thinking out what such marriage meant. In the first place it meant ridicule, in the next place ridicule, in the last place ridicule. She would eat chicken bones with her fingers, those fingers his lips still burned to kiss. She would dance wildly with other men. She would talk of her dear father town, and all the time her eyes would look beyond him, somewhere or other into some D place he knew nothing of. He sprang up and paced the room, and for a moment thought he would go mad. They meant him to marry her. Even she meant him to marry her. Her tantalizing inscrutability, her sudden little tendernesses, her quick laughter, her swift, burning kisses, even the movements of her hands, her tears, all were evidence against her. Not one of these things that nature made her do counted on her side, but how they fanned his longing, his desire, and distress. He went to the glass and tried to part his hair with his fingers, but being rather fine, it fell into lank streaks. There was no comfort to be got from it. He drew his muddy boots on. Suddenly he thought, if I could see her alone, I could arrive at some arrangement. Then, with a sense of stupefaction, he made the discovery that no arrangement could possibly be made that would not be dangerous, even desperate. He seized his hat, and, like a rabbit that has been fired at, bolted from the room. He plodded along amongst the damp woods with his head down, and resentment and dismay in his heart. But, as the sun rose, and the air grew sweet with pine scent, he slowly regained a sort of equability. After all, she had already yielded, it was not as if. And the tramp of his own footsteps lulled him into feeling that it would all come right. Look at the thing practically, he thought. The faster he walked, the firmer became his conviction that he could still see it through. He took out his watch, it was past 7, he began to hasten back. In the yard of the inn his driver was harnessing the horses. Swithin went up to him. "Who told you to put them in?" he asked. The driver answered, "Der Herr." Swithin turned away. In 10 minutes he thought, I shall be in that carriage again, with this going on in my head. Driving away from England, from all I'm used to, driving to, what? Could he face it? Could he face all that he had been through that morning, face it day after day, night after night? Looking up, he saw Rosie at her open window gazing down at him. Never had she looked sweeter, more roguish. An inexplicable terror seized on him. He ran across the yard and jumped into his carriage. "To Salzburg," he cried, "drive on!" And rattling out of the yard without a look behind, he flung a sovereign at the hostler. Flying back along the road faster even than he had come, with pale face, and eyes blank and staring like a pug dog's, Swithin spoke no single word, nor, till he had reached the door of his lodgings, did he suffer the driver to draw rein. 12 towards evening, 5 days later, Swithin, yellow and travel-worn, was ferried in a gondola to Daniela's hotel. His brother, who was on the steps, looked at him with an apprehensive curiosity. "Why, it's you," he mumbled. "So you've got here safe?" "Safe," growled Swithin. James replied, "I thought you wouldn't leave your friends." Then, with a jerk of suspicion, "You haven't brought your friends." "What friends?" growled Swithin. James changed the subject. "You don't look the thing," he said. "Really," muttered Swithin, "what's that to you?" He appeared at dinner that night, but fell asleep over his coffee. Neither Trequarry nor James asked him any further question, nor did they allude to Salzburg, and during the 4 days which concluded the stay in Venice Swithin went about with his head up, but his eyes half closed like a dazed man. Only after they had taken ship at Genoa did he show signs of any healthy interest in life, when, finding that a man on board was perpetually strumming, he locked the piano up and pitched the key into the sea. That winter in London he behaved much as usual, but fits of moroseness would seize on him, during which he was not pleasant to approach. One evening when he was walking with a friend in Piccadilly, a girl coming from a side street accosted him in German. Swithin, after staring at her in silence for some seconds, handed her a £5 note, to the great amazement of his friend, nor could he himself have explained the meaning of this freak of generosity. Of Rosie he never heard again. This, then, was the substance of what he remembered as he lay ill in bed. Stretching out his hand he pressed the bell. His valet appeared, crossing the room like a cat, a Swede, who had been with Swithin many years, a little man with a dried face and fierce moustache, morbidly sharp nerves, and a queer devotion to his master. Swithin made a feeble gesture. "Adolf," he said, "I'm very bad." "Yes, sir." "Why do you stand there like a cow?" asked Swithin. "Can't you see I'm very bad?" "Yes, sir." The valet's face twitched as though it masked the dance of obscure emotions. "I shall feel better after dinner." "What time is it?" 5 o'clock. "I thought it was more." "The afternoons are very long." "Yes, sir." Swithin sighed, as though he had expected the consolation of denial. "Very likely I shall have a nap." "Bring up hot water at 6:30 and shave me before dinner." The valet moved towards the door. Swithin raised himself. "What did Mr. James say to you?" "He said you ought to have another doctor, 2 doctors, he said, better than one. He said, also, he would look in again on his way home. Swithin grunted, "Umph." "What else did he say?" "He said you didn't take care of yourself." Swithin glared. "Has anybody else been to see me?" The valet turned away his eyes. "Mrs. Thomas Forsyte came last Monday fortnight." "How long have I been ill?" 5 weeks on Saturday." "Do you think I'm very bad?" Adolph's face was covered suddenly with crow's feet. "You have no business to ask me question like that. I am not paid, sir, to answer question like that." Swithin said faintly, "You're a peppery fool. Open a bottle of champagne." Adolph took a bottle of champagne from a cupboard and held nippers to it. He fixed his eyes on Swithin. The doctor said, "Open the bottle." "It is not, open the bottle, or I give you warning." Adolph removed the cork. He wiped a glass elaborately, filled it, and bore it scrupulously to the bedside. Suddenly twirling his moustaches, he wrung his hands, and burst out, "It is poison." Swithin grinned faintly. "You foreign fool," he said. "Get out." The valet vanished. He forgot himself, thought Swithin. Slowly he raised the glass, slowly put it back, and sank gasping on his pillows. Almost at once he fell asleep. He dreamed that he was at his club, sitting after dinner in the crowded smoking room, with its bright walls and trefoils of light. It was there that he sat every evening, patient, solemn, lonely, and sometimes fell asleep, his square, pale old face nodding to one side. He dreamed that he was gazing at the picture over the fireplace, of an old statesman with a high collar, supremely finished face, and skeptical eyebrows, the picture, smooth, and reticent as sealing wax, of one who seemed forever exhaling the narrow wisdom of final judgments. All round him, his fellow members were chattering. Only he himself, the old sick member, was silent. If fellows only knew what it was like to sit by yourself and feel ill all the time. What they were saying he had heard 100 times. They were talking of investments, of cigars, horses, actresses, machinery. What was that? A foreign patent for cleaning boilers. There was no such thing, boilers couldn't be cleaned, any fool knew that. If an Englishman couldn't clean a boiler, no foreigner could clean one. He appealed to the old statesman's eyes. But for once those eyes seemed hesitating, blurred, wanting in finality. They vanished. In their place were Rosy's little deep-set eyes, with their wide and far-off look, and as he gazed they seemed to grow bright as steel, and to speak to him. Slowly the whole face grew to be there, floating on the dark background of the picture. It was pink, aloof, unfathomable, enticing, with its fluffy hair and quick lips, just as he had last seen it. "Are you looking for something?" she seemed to say. "I could show you." "I have everything safe enough," answered Swithin, and in his sleep he groaned. He felt the touch of fingers on his forehead. I'm dreaming, he thought in his dream. She had vanished, and far away, from behind the picture, came a sound of footsteps. Aloud, in his sleep, Swithin muttered, "I've missed it." Again he heard the rustling of those light footsteps, and close in his ear a sound, like a sob. He awoke, the sob was his own. Great drops of perspiration stood on his forehead. What is it, he thought, what have I lost? Slowly his mind travelled over his investments. He could not think of any single one that was unsafe. What was it, then, that he had lost? Struggling on his pillows, he clutched the wine glass. His lips touched the wine. This isn't the Heedsek, he thought angrily, and before the reality of that displeasure all the dim vision passed away. But as he bent to drink, something snapped, and, with a sigh, Swithin Forsyte died above the bubbles. When James Forsyte came in again on his way home, the valet, trembling, took his hat and stick. "How's your master?" "My master is dead, sir." "Dead? He can't be. I left him safe an hour ago." On the bed Swithin's body was doubled like a sack, his hand still grasped the glass. James Forsyte paused. "Swithin," he said, and with his hand to his ear he waited for an answer, but none came, and slowly in the glass a last bubble rose and burst. December 1900. To my sister Mabel Edith Reynolds. The silent sigh. In a car of the Naples Express a mining expert was diving into a bag for papers. The strong sunlight showed the fine wrinkles on his brown face and the shabbiness of his short, rough beard. A newspaper cutting slipped from his fingers. He picked it up, thinking, how the dickens did that get in here? It was from a colonial print of 3 years back, and he sat staring, as if in that forlorn slip of yellow paper he had encountered some ghost from his past. These were the words he read: "We hope that the setback to civilization, the check to commerce and development, in this promising center of our colony may be but temporary, and that capital may again come to the rescue. Where one man was successful, others should surely not fail. We are convinced that it only needs," and the last words, "for what can be sadder than to see the forest spreading its lengthening shadows, like symbols of defeat, over the untenanted dwellings of men, and where was once the merry chatter of human voices, to pass by in the silence." On an afternoon, 13 years before, he had been in the city of London, at one of those emporiums where mining experts perch, before fresh flights, like seagulls on some favorite rock. A clerk said to him, "Mr. Scoria, they are asking for you downstairs, Mr. Hemmings of the New Colliery Company." Scoria took up the speaking tube. "Is that you, Mr. Scoria? I hope you are very well, sir. I am, Hemmings. I am, coming up." In 2 minutes he appeared, Christopher Hemmings, secretary of the New Colliery Company, known in the city, behind his back, as Down by the Starn Hemmings. He grasped Scoria's hand. The gesture was deferential, yet distinguished. Too handsome, too capable, too important, his figure, The cut of his iron-grey beard, and his intrusively fine eyes, conveyed a continual courteous invitation to inspect their infallibilities. He stood, like a city atlas with his legs apart, his coat-tails gathered in his hands, a whole globe of financial matters deftly balanced on his nose. "Look at me," he seemed to say. "It's heavy, but how easily I carry it. Not the man to let it down, sir." "I hope I see you well, Mr. Scoria," he began. "I have come round about our mine. There is a question of a fresh field being opened up, between ourselves, not before it's wanted. I find it difficult to get my board to take a comprehensive view. In short, the question is, are you prepared to go out for us, and report on it? The fees will be all right." His left eye closed. "Things have been very, Dicky, we are going to change our superintendent. I have got little Pippin, you know little Pippin." Scoria murmured, with a feeling of vague resentment, "Oh yes. He's not a mining man." Hemmings replied, "We think that he will do." "Do you?" thought Scoria, "that's good of you." He had not altogether shaken off a worship he had felt for Pippin. King Pippin he was always called, when they had been boys at the Camborne Grammar School. King Pippin. The boy with the bright color, very bright hair, bright, subtle, elusive eyes, broad shoulders, little stoop in the neck, and a way of moving it quickly like a bird. The boy who was always at the top of everything, and held his head as if looking for something further to be the top of. He remembered how one day King Pippin had said to him in his soft way, "Young Scory, I'll do your sums for you," and in answer to his dubious, "Is that all right?" had replied, "Of course, I don't want you to get behind that beast Blake, he's not a Cornishman." The beast Blake was an Irishman not yet 12. He remembered, too, an occasion when King Pippin with 2 other boys fought 6 louts and got a licking, and how Pippin sat for half an hour afterwards, all bloody, his head in his hands, rocking to and fro, and weeping tears of mortification, and how the next day he had sneaked off by himself, and, attacking the same gang, got frightfully mauled a second time. Thinking of these things he answered curtly, "When shall I start?" "Down by the Starn." Hemmings replied with a sort of fearful sprightliness, "There's a good fellow. I will send instructions. So glad to see you well." Conferring on Scoria a look, fine to the verge of vulgarity, he withdrew. Scoria remained, seated, heavy with insignificance and vague oppression, as if he had drunk a tumbler of sweet port. A week later, in company with Pippin, he was on board a liner. The King Pippin of his school days was now a man of 44. He awakened in Scoria the uncertain wonder with which men look backward at their uncomplicated teens, and staggering up and down the decks in the long Atlantic roll, he would steal glances at his companion, as if he expected to find out from them something about himself. Pippin had still King Pippin's bright, fine hair, and dazzling streaks in his short beard. He had still a bright color and suave voice, and what there were of wrinkles suggested only subtleties of humor and ironic sympathy. From the first, and apparently without negotiation, he had his seat at the captain's table, to which on the second day Scoria too found himself translated, and had to sit, as he expressed it ruefully, among the bigwigs. During the voyage only one incident impressed itself on Scoria's memory, and that for a disconcerting reason. In the forecastle were the usual complement of emigrants. One evening, leaning across the rail to watch them, he felt a touch on his arm, and, looking round, saw Pippin's face and beard quivering in the lamplight. "Poor people," he said. The idea flashed on Scoria that he was like some fine wire sound recording instrument. Suppose he were to snap, he thought. Impelled to justify this fancy, he blurted out, "You're a nervous chap. The way you look at those poor devils." Pippin hustled him along the deck. "Come, come, you took me off my guard," he murmured, with a sly, gentle smile, "that's not fair." He found it a continual source of wonder that Pippin, at his age, should cut himself adrift from the associations and security of London life to begin a new career in a new country with dubious prospect of success. "I always heard he was doing well all round," he thought. "Thinks he'll better himself, perhaps. He's a true Cornishman." The morning of arrival at the mines was grey and cheerless. A cloud of smoke, beaten down by drizzle, clung above the forest. The wooden houses straggled dismally in the unkempt semblance of a street, against a background of endless, silent woods. An air of blank discouragement brooded over everything. Cranes jutted idly over empty trucks. The long jetty oozed black slime. Miners with listless faces stood in the rain. Dogs fought under their very legs. On the way to the hotel they met no one busy or serene except a Chinese who was polishing a dish cover. The late superintendent, a cowed man, regaled them at lunch with his forebodings. His attitude toward the situation was like the food, which was greasy and uninspiring. Alone together once more, the two newcomers eyed each other sadly. "Oh dear," sighed Pippin. "We must change all this, Scoria. It will never do to go back beaten." "I shall not go back beaten. You will have to carry me on my shield," and slyly, "Too heavy, eh?" Poor fellow. Then for a long time he was silent, moving his lips as if adding up the cost. Suddenly he sighed, and grasping Scoria's arm, said, "Dull, aren't I? What will you do?" "Put me in your report, new superintendent." Sad, dull dog, not a word to throw at a cat. And as if the new task were too much for him, he sank back in thought. The last words he said to Scoria that night were, "Very silent here. It's hard to believe one's here for life. But I feel I am. Mustn't be a coward, though," and brushing his forehead, as though to clear from it a cobweb of faint thoughts, he hurried off. Scoria stayed on the veranda smoking. The rain had ceased, a few stars were burning dimly, even above the squalor of the township. The scent of the forests, the interminable forests, brooded. There sprang into his mind the memory of a picture from one of his children's fairy books, the picture of a little bearded man on tiptoe, with poised head and a great sword, slashing at the castle of a giant. It reminded him of Pippin. And suddenly, even to Scoria, whose existence was one long encounter with strange places, the unseen presence of those woods, their heavy, healthy scent, the little sounds, like squeaks from tiny toys, issuing out of the gloomy silence, seemed intolerable, to be shunned, from the mere instinct of self-preservation. He thought of the evening he had spent in the bosom of down by the Starn Hemmings family, receiving his last instructions, the security of that suburban villa, its discouraging gentility, the superior acidity of the Miss Hemmings, the noble names of large contractors, of company promoters, of a peer, dragged with the lightness of gun carriages across the conversation, the autocracy of Hemmings, rasped up here and there, by some domestic contradiction. It was all so nice and safe, as if the whole thing had been fastened to an anchor sunk beneath the pink cabbages of the drawing-room carpet. Hemmings, seeing him off the premises, had said with secrecy, "Little Pippin will have a good thing. We shall make his salary L. He'll be a great man, quite a king." Ha ha! Scoria shook the ashes from his pipe. Salary, he thought, straining his ears, I wouldn't take the place for £5,000 a year. And yet it's a fine country, and with ironic violence he repeated, a dashed fine country. 10 days later, having finished his report on the new mine, he stood on the jetty waiting to go aboard the steamer for home. "God bless you," said Pippin. "Tell them they needn't be afraid, and sometimes when you're at home think of me, eh?" Scoria, scrambling on board, had a confused memory of tears in his eyes, and a convulsive handshake. It was 8 years before the wheels of life carried Scoria back to that disenchanted spot, and this time not on the business of the new colliery company. He went for another company with a mine some 30 miles away. Before starting, however, he visited Hemmings. The secretary was surrounded by pigeonholes, and finer than ever, Scoria blinked in the full radiance of his courtesy. A little man with eyebrows full of questions, and a grizzled beard, was seated in an armchair by the fire. "You know Mr. Booker," said Hemmings, "one of my directors. This is Mr. Scoria, sir, who went out for us." These sentences were murmured in a way suggestive of their uncommon value. The director uncrossed his legs, and bowed. Scoria also bowed, and Hemmings, leaning back, slowly developed the full resources of his waistcoat. "So you are going out again, Scoria, for the other side?" "I tell Mr. Scoria, sir, that he is going out for the enemy. Don't find them a mine as good as you found us, there's a good man." The little director asked explosively, "See our last dividend? 20%, eh, what?" Hemmings moved a finger, as if reproving his director. "I will not disguise from you," he murmured, "that there is friction between us and the enemy. You know our position too well, just a little too well, eh?" A nod's as good as a wink. His diplomatic eyes flattered Scoria, who passed a hand over his brow, and said, "Of course." Pippin doesn't hit it off with them. Between ourselves, he's a little too big for his boots. You know what it is when a man in his position gets a sudden rise. Scoria caught himself searching on the floor for a sight of Hemming's boots. He raised his eyes guiltily. The secretary continued, "We don't hear from him quite as often as we should like, in fact." To his own surprise, Scoria murmured, "It's a silent place." The secretary smiled. "Very good. Mr. Scoria says, sir, it's a silent place, ha ha. I call that very good." But suddenly a secret irritation seemed to bubble in him. He burst forth almost violently, "He's no business to let it affect him, now, has he? I put it to you, Mr. Scoria, I put it to you, sir." But Scoria made no reply, and soon after took his leave. He had been asked to convey a friendly hint to Pippin that more frequent letters would be welcomed. Standing in the shadow of the Royal Exchange, waiting to thread his way across, he thought, "So you must have noise, must you? You've got some here, and to spare." On his arrival in the New World, he wired to Pippin asking if he might stay with him on the way up country, and received the answer, "Be sure and come." A week later he arrived. There was now a railway, and found Pippin waiting for him in a phaeton. Scoria would not have known the place again. There was a glitter over everything, as if someone had touched it with a wand. The tracks had given place to roads, running firm, straight, and black between the trees under brilliant sunshine. The wooden houses were all painted. Out in the gleaming harbour amongst the green of islands lay 3 steamers, each with a fleet of busy boats, and here and there a tiny yacht floated, like a seabird on the water. Pippin drove his long-tailed horses furiously, his eyes brimmed with subtle kindness, as if according Scoria a continual welcome. During the 2 days of his stay, Scoria never lost that sense of glamour. He had every opportunity for observing the grip Pippin had over everything. The wooden doors and walls of his bungalow kept out no sounds. He listened to interviews between his host and all kinds and conditions of men. The voices of the visitors would rise at first, angry, discontented, matter-of-fact, with nasal twang, or guttural drawl. Then would come the soft patter of the superintendent's feet crossing and recrossing the room. Then a pause, the sound of hard breathing, and quick questions, the visitor's voice again the patter, and Pippin's ingratiating but decisive murmurs. Presently out would come the visitor with an expression on his face which Scoria soon began to know by heart, a kind of pleased, puzzled, helpless look, which seemed to say, "I've been done, I know, I'll give it to myself when I'm round the corner." Pippin was full of wistful questions about home. He wanted to talk of music, pictures, plays, of how London looked, what new streets there were, and, above all, whether Scoria had been lately in the West Country. He talked of getting leave next winter, asked whether Scoria thought they would put up with him at home. Then, with the agitation which had alarmed Scoria before, he added, but I'm not fit for home now. One gets spoiled, it's big and silent here. What should I go back to? I don't seem to realize. Scoria thought of Hemmings. "Tea's a bit cramped there, certainly," he muttered. Pippin went on as if divining his thoughts. "I suppose our friend Hemmings would call me foolish. He's above the little weaknesses of imagination, eh?" "Yes, it's silent here. Sometimes in the evening I would give my head for somebody to talk to. Hemmings would never give his head for anything, I think. But all the same, I couldn't face them at home. Spoiled." And slyly he murmured, "What would the board say if they could hear that?" Scoria blurted out, "To tell you the truth, they complain a little of not hearing from you." Pippin put out a hand, as if to push something away. "Let them try the life here," he broke out. "It's like sitting on a live volcano, what with our friends, the enemy over there, the men, the American competition. I keep it going, Scoria, but at what a cost, at what a cost." "But surely, letters." Pippin only answered, I try. Scoria felt with remorse and wonder that he had spoken the truth. The following day he left for his inspection, and while in the camp of the enemy much was the talk he heard of Pippin. "Why," said his host, "the superintendent, a little man with a face somewhat like an owl's. D'you know the name they've given him down in the capital? The King. Good, eh? He's made them sit up all along this coast. I like him well enough, good-hearted man, shocking nervous, but my people down there can't stand him at any price. Sir, he runs this colony. You'd think butter wouldn't melt in that mouth of his, but he always gets his way. That's what riles em so, that and the success he's making of his mine. It puzzles me. You'd think he'd only be too glad of a quiet life, a man with his nerves. But no, he's never happy unless he's fighting something where he's got a chance to score a victory. I won't say he likes it, but, by Jove, it seems he's got to do it. Now that's funny. I'll tell you one thing, though shouldn't be a bit surprised if he broke down someday, and I'll tell you another," he added darkly, "he's sailing very near the wind, with those large contracts that he makes. I wouldn't care to take his risks. Just let them have a strike, or something that shuts them down for a spell, and mark my words, sir, it'll be all up with them. But," he concluded confidentially, "I wish I had his hold on the men. It's a great thing in this country. Not like home, where you can go round a corner and get another gang. You have to make the best you can out of the lot you have. You won't get another man for love or money without you ship him a few 100 miles." And with a frown he waved his arm over the forests to indicate the barrenness of the land. 3 Scoria finished his inspection and went on a shooting trip into the forest. His host met him on his return. "Just look at this," he said, holding out a telegram. "Awful, isn't it?" His face expressed a profound commiseration, almost ludicrously mixed with the ashamed contentment that men experience at the misfortunes of an enemy. The telegram, dated the day before, ran thus: "Frightful explosion New Colliery this morning, great loss of life feared." Scoria had the bewildered thought, Pippin will want me now. He took leave of his host, who called after him, "You'd better wait for a steamer. It's a beastly drive." Scoria shook his head. All night, jolting along a rough track cut through the forest, he thought of Pippin. The other miseries of this calamity at present left him cold. He barely thought of the smothered men, but Pippin's struggle, his lonely struggle with this hydra-headed monster, touched him very nearly. He fell asleep and dreamed of watching Pippin slowly strangled by a snake, the agonized, kindly, ironic face peeping out between two gleaming coils was so horribly real, that he awoke. It was the moment before dawn. Pitch-black branches barred the sky, with every jolt of the wheels the gleams from the lamps danced, fantastic and intrusive, round ferns and tree stems, into the cold heart of the forest. For an hour or more Scoria tried to feign sleep, and hide from the stillness, and overmastering gloom of these great woods. Then softly a whisper of noises stole forth, a stir of light, and the whole slow radiance of the morning glory. But it brought no warmth, and Scoria wrapped himself closer in his cloak, feeling as though old age had touched him. Close on noon he reached the township. Glamour seemed still to hover over it. He drove on to the mine. The winding engine was turning, the pulley at the top of the headgear whizzing round. Nothing looked unusual. Some mistake, he thought. He drove to the mine buildings, alighted, and climbed to the shaft head. Instead of the usual rumbling of the trolleys, the rattle of coal discharged over the screens, there was silence. Close by, Pippin himself was standing, smirched with dirt. The cage, coming swift and silent from below, shot open its doors with a sharp rattle. Scoria bent forward to look. There lay a dead man, with a smile on his face. "How many?" he whispered. Pippin answered, 84 brought up, 47 still below, and entered the man's name in a pocket book. An older man was taken out next. He too was smiling. There had been vouchsafed to him, it seemed, a taste of more than earthly joy. The sight of those strange smiles affected Scoria more than all the anguish or despair he had seen scored on the faces of other dead men. He asked an old miner how long Pippin had been at work. 30 hours. Yesterday he were below, we had to nigh carry mun up at last. He's for going down again, but the chaps won't lower mun. The old man gave a sigh. I'm waiting for my boy to come up, I am. Scoria waited too. There was fascination about those dead, smiling faces. The rescuing of these men who would never again breathe went on and on. Scoria grew sleepy in the sun. The old miner woke him, saying, "Rummy stuff this here chokedamp, see, they all dies drunk." The very next to be brought up was the chief engineer. Scoria had known him quite well, one of those Scotsmen who are born at the age of 40 and remain so all their lives. His face, the only one that wore no smile, seemed grieving that duty had deprived it of that last luxury. With wide eyes and drawn lips he had died protesting. Late in the afternoon the old miner touched Scoria's arm, and said, "There he is, there's my boy." And he departed slowly, wheeling the body on a trolley. As the sun set, the gang below came up. No further search was possible till the fumes had cleared. Scoria heard one man say, "There's some we'll never get, they've had sure burial." Another answered him, "'Tis a good enough bag for me." They passed him, the whites of their eyes gleaming out of faces black as ink. Pippin drove him home at a furious pace, not uttering a single word. As they turned into the main street, a young woman starting out before the horses obliged Pippin to pull up. The glance he bent on Scoria was ludicrously prescient of suffering. The woman asked for her husband. Several times they were stopped thus by women asking for their husbands or sons. "This is what I have to go through," Pippin whispered. When they had eaten, he said to Scoria, "It was kind of you to come and stand by me. They take me for a god, poor creature that I am. But shall I ever get the men down again? Their nerves shaken. I wish I were one of those poor lads, to die with a smile like that." Scoria felt the futility of his presence. On Pippin alone must be the heat and burden. Would he stand under it, or would the whole thing come crashing to the ground? He urged him again and again to rest, but Pippin only gave him one of his queer smiles. "You don't know how strong I am," he said. For he himself slept heavily, and, waking at dawn, went down. Pippin was still at his desk, his pen had dropped, he was asleep. The ink was wet. Scoria's eye caught the opening words, "Gentlemen, since this happened I have not slept." He stole away again with a sense of indignation that no one could be dragged in to share that fight. The London boardroom rose before his mind. He imagined the portentous gravity of Hemmings, his face and voice and manner conveying the impression that he alone could save the situation. The 6 directors, all men of common sense and certainly humane, seated behind large turret-shaped inkpots, the concern and irritation in their voices, asking how it could have happened, their comments, "An awful thing. I suppose Pippin is doing the best he can. Wire him on no account to leave the mine idle. Poor devils. A fund. Of course, what ought we to give?" He had a strong conviction that nothing of all this would disturb the common sense with which they would go home and eat their mutton. A good thing too, the less it was taken to heart the better. But Scoria felt angry. The fight was so unfair. A fellow all nerves, with not a soul to help him. Well, it was his own lookout. He had chosen to center it all in himself, to make himself its very soul. If he gave way now, the ship must go down. By a thin thread, Scoria's hero worship still held. Man against nature, he thought, I back the man. The struggle in which he was so powerless to give aid, became intensely personal to him, as if he had engaged his own good faith therein. The next day they went down again to the pit head, and Scoria himself descended. The fumes had almost cleared, but there were some places which would never be reached. At the end of the day all but 4 bodies had been recovered. In the day o' judgment a miner said, "They fall come out of here." Those unclaimed bodies haunted Scoria. He came on sentences of writing, where men waiting to be suffocated had written down their feelings. In one place, the hour, the word sleepy and a signature. In another, a F. Done for. When he came up at last Pippin was still waiting, pocketbook in hand. They again departed at a furious pace. 2 days later Scoria, visiting the shaft, found its neighborhood deserted. Not a living thing of any sort was there except one Chinaman poking his stick into the rubbish. Pippin was away down the coast engaging an engineer, and on his return, Scoria had not the heart to tell him of the desertion. He was spared the effort, for Pippin said, "Don't be afraid, you've got bad news. The men have gone on strike." Scoria sighed. "Lock, stock, and barrel, I thought so. See what I have here." He put before Scoria a telegram, "At all costs keep working, fatal to stop, manage this somehow. Hemmings." Breathing quickly, he added, "As if I didn't know. Manage this somehow, a little hard." "What's to be done?" asked Scoria. "You see I am commanded." Pippin answered bitterly. "And they're quite right, we must keep working, our contracts. Now I'm down, not a soul will spare me." The miners' meeting was held the following day on the outskirts of the town. Pippin had cleared the place to make a public recreation ground, a sort of feather in the company's cap. It was now to be the spot whereon should be decided the question of the company's life or death. The sky to the west was crossed by a single line of cloud like a bar of beaten gold. Tree shadows crept towards the groups of men. The evening savor, that strong fragrance of the forest, sweetened the air. The miners stood all round amongst the burnt tree stumps, cowed and sullen. They looked incapable of movement or expression. It was this dumb paralysis that frightened Scoria. He watched Pippin speaking from his phaeton, the butt of all those sullen, restless eyes. Would he last out? Would the wires hold? It was like the finish of a race. He caught a baffled look on Pippin's face, as if he despaired of piercing that terrible paralysis. The men's eyes had begun to wander. "He's lost his hold," thought Scoria, "it's all up." A miner close beside him muttered, "Look out." Pippin was leaning forward, his voice had risen. The words fell like a whiplash on the faces of the crowd. "You shan't throw me over. Do you think I'll give up all I've done for you? I'll make you the first power in the colony. Are you turning tail at the first shot? You're a set of cowards, my lads." Each man round Scoria was listening with a different motion of the hands. One rubbed them, one clenched them, another moved his closed fist, as if stabbing someone in the back. A grizzly-bearded, beetle-browed, twinkling-eyed old Cornishman muttered, Not troublin' about that." It seemed almost as if Pippin's object was to get the men to kill him. They had gathered closer, crouching for a rush. Suddenly Pippin's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm disgraced, men, are you going back on me? The old miner next Scoria called out suddenly, Annie, that's Cornishman here to stand by the superintendent. A group drew together, and with murmurs and gesticulation the meeting broke up. In the evening a deputation came to visit Pippin, and all night long their voices and the superintendent's footsteps could be heard. In the morning, Pippin went early to the mine. Before supper the deputation came again, and again Scoria had to listen hour after hour to the sound of voices and footsteps till he fell asleep. Just before dawn he was awakened by a light. Pippin stood at his bedside. The men go down tomorrow, he said. What did I tell you? Carry me home on my shield, eh? In a week the mine was in full work. 2 years later, Scoria heard once more of Pippin. A note from Hemmings reached him asking if he could make it convenient to attend their board meeting the following Thursday. He arrived rather before the appointed time. The secretary received him, and, in answer to inquiry, said, Thank you, we are doing well. Between ourselves, we are doing very well. And Pippin? The secretary frowned. Ah, Pippin. We asked you to come on his account. Pippin is giving us a lot of trouble. We have not had a single line from him for just 2 years. He spoke with such a sense of personal grievance that Scoria felt quite sorry for him. Not a single line, said Hemmings, since that explosion. You were there at the time, I remember. It makes it very awkward, I call it personal to me. But how? Scoria began. We get telegrams. He writes to no one, not even to his family. And why? Just tell me why. We hear of him, he's a great knob out there. Nothing's done in the colony without his finger being in the pie. He turned out the last government because they wouldn't grant us an extension for our railway, shows he can't be a fool. Besides, look at our balance sheet. It turned out that the question on which Scoria's opinion was desired was, whether Hemmings should be sent out to see what was the matter with the superintendent. During the discussion which ensued, he was an unwilling listener to strictures on Pippin's silence. The explosion, he muttered at last, a very trying time. Mr. Booker pounced on him. A very trying time. So it was, to all of us. But what excuse is that, now, Mr. Scoria? What excuse is that? Scoria was obliged to admit that it was none. Business is business, eh, what? Scoria, gazing round that neat boardroom, nodded. A deaf director, who had not spoken for some months, said with sudden fierceness, It's disgraceful. He was obviously letting off the fume of long unuttered disapprovals. One perfectly neat, benevolent old fellow, however, who had kept his hat on, and had a single vice, that of coming to the boardroom with a brown paper parcel tied up with string, murmured, We must make all allowances, and started an anecdote about his youth. He was gently called to order by his secretary. Scoria was asked for his opinion. He looked at Hemmings. "My importance is concerned" was written all over the secretary's face. Moved by an impulse of loyalty to Pippin, Scoria answered, as if it were all settled, "Well, let me know when you are starting, Hemmings. I should like the trip myself." As he was going out, the chairman, old Jolyon Forsyte, with a grave, twinkling look at Hemmings, took him aside. "Glad to hear you say that about going to, Mr. Scoria. We must be careful. Pippin's such a good fellow, and so sensitive, and our friend there, a bit heavy in the hand." Scoria did in fact go out with Hemmings. The secretary was seasick, and his prostration, dignified but noisy, remained a memory forever. It was sonorous and fine, the prostration of superiority, and the way in which he spoke of it, taking casual acquaintances into the caves of his experience, was truly interesting. Pippin came down to the capital to escort them, provided for their comforts as if they had been royalty, and had a special train to take them to the mines. He was a little stouter, brighter of color, grayer of beard, more nervous perhaps in voice and breathing. His manner to Hemmings was full of flattering courtesy, but his sly, ironical glances played on the secretary's armor like a fountain on a hippopotamus. To Scoria, however, he could not show enough affection. The first evening, when Hemmings had gone to his room, he jumped up like a boy out of school. "So I'm going to get a wigging," he said. "I suppose I deserve it, but if you only knew. Out here they've nicknamed me the king, they say I rule the colony. It's myself that I can't rule." And with a sudden burst of passion such as Scoria had never seen in him, "Why did they send this man here? What can he know about the things that I've been through?" In a moment he calmed down again. "There, this is very stupid, worrying you like this," and with a long, kind look into Scoria's face, he hustled him off to bed. Pippin did not break out again, though fire seemed to smoulder behind the bars of his courteous irony. Intuition of danger had evidently smitten Hemmings, for he made no allusion to the object of his visit. There were moments when Scoria's common sense sided with Hemmings. These were moments when the secretary was not present. After all, he told himself, it's a little thing to ask, 1 letter a month. I never heard of such a case. It was wonderful indeed how they stood it. It showed how much they valued Pippin. What was the matter with him? What was the nature of his trouble? One glimpse Scoria had when even Hemmings, as he phrased it, received quite a turn. It was during a drive back from the most outlying of the company's trial mines, 8 miles through the forest. The track led through a belt of trees blackened by a forest fire. Pippin was driving. The secretary seated beside him wore an expression of faint alarm, such as Pippin's driving was warranted to evoke from almost any face. The sky had darkened strangely, but pale streaks of light, coming from one knew not where, filtered through the trees. No breath was stirring, the wheels and horses' hoofs made no sound on the deep fern mold. All around, the burnt tree trunks, leafless and jagged, rose like withered giants. The passages between them were black, the sky black, and black the silence. No one spoke, and literally the only sound was Pippin's breathing. What was it that was so terrifying? Scoria had a feeling of entombment, that nobody could help him, the feeling of being face to face with nature, a sensation as if all the comfort and security of words and rules had dropped away from him. And nothing happened. They reached home and dined. During dinner he had again that old remembrance of a little man chopping at a castle with his sword. It came at a moment when Pippin had raised his hand with the carving knife grasped in it to answer some remark of Hemming's about the future of the company. The optimism in his uplifted chin, the strenuous energy in his whispering voice, gave Scoria a more vivid glimpse of Pippin's nature than he had perhaps ever had before. This new country, where nothing but himself could help a man, that was the castle. No wonder Pippin was impatient of control, no wonder he was out of hand, no wonder he was silent, chopping away at that. And suddenly he thought, yes, and all the time one knows, nature must beat him in the end. That very evening Hemmings delivered himself of his reproof. He had sat unusually silent. Scoria, indeed, had thought him a little drunk, so portentous was his gravity. Suddenly, however, he rose. It was hard on a man, he said, in his position, with a board, he spoke as of a family of small children, to be kept so short of information. He was actually compelled to use his imagination to answer the shareholders' questions. This was painful and humiliating. He had never heard of any secretary having to use his imagination. He went further, it was insulting. He had grown grey in the service of the company. Mr. Scoria would bear him out when he said he had a position to maintain, his name in the city was a high one, and, by George, he was going to keep it a high one. He would allow nobody to drag it in the dust, that ought clearly to be understood. His directors felt they were being treated like children, however that might be. It was absurd to suppose that he, Hemmings, could be treated like a child. The secretary paused, his eyes seemed to bully the room. If there were no London office, murmured Pippin, the shareholders would get the same dividends. Hemmings gasped. Come, he said, this is monstrous. What help did I get from London when I first came here? What help have I ever had? Hemmings swayed, recovered, and with a forced smile replied that, if this were true, he had been standing on his head for years. He did not believe the attitude possible for such a length of time. Personally, he would have thought that he too had had a little something to say to the company's position, but no matter. His irony was crushing. It was possible that Mr. Pippin hoped to reverse the existing laws of the universe with regard to limited companies. He would merely say that he must not begin with a company of which he, Hemmings, happened to be secretary. Mr. Scoria had hinted at excuses. For his part, with the best intentions in the world, he had great difficulty in seeing them. He would go further, he did not see them. The explosion. Pippin shrank so visibly that Hemmings seemed troubled by a suspicion that he had gone too far. "We know," he said, "that it was trying for you." "Trying?" burst out Pippin. "No one can say," Hemmings resumed soothingly, "that we have not dealt liberally." Pippin made a motion of the head. "We think we have a good superintendent, I go further, an excellent superintendent. What I say is, let's be pleasant. I am not making an unreasonable request." He ended on a fitting note of jocularity, and, as if by consent, all three withdrew, each to his own room, without another word. In the course of the next day Pippin said to Scoria, "It seems I have been very wicked. I must try to do better," and with a touch of bitter humor, "they are kind enough to think me a good superintendent, you see. After that I must try hard." Scoria broke in, "No man could have done so much for them," and, carried away by an impulse to put things absolutely straight, went on, "But, after all, a letter now and then, what does it amount to?" Pippin besieged him with a subtle glance. "You too," he said, "I must indeed have been a wicked man," and turned away. Scoria felt as if he had been guilty of brutality, sorry for Pippin, angry with himself, angry with Pippin, sorry for himself. He earnestly desired to see the back of Hemmings. The secretary gratified the wish a few days later, departing by steamer with ponderous expressions of regard and the assurance of his goodwill. Pippin gave vent to no outburst of relief, maintaining a courteous silence, making only one allusion to his late guest, in answer to a remark of Scoria, "Ah, don't tempt me, mustn't speak behind his back." 6 months passed, and Scoria still remained Pippin's guest. As each mail day approached he experienced a queer suppressed excitement. On one of these occasions Pippin had